Hey survivors, welcome to the channel. I'm Trombo, and I have some combat questions for Project Zomboid. If you've been following this game, you know it is super deep on the survival side, and the combat side is no different. For example, what do you think happens when you attack an armored zombie, or when you use one hand for a weapon instead of two? What do weapon skill levels actually do for us? Or what happens if our character is panicked or suffering horrific wounds on their fighting arm? To get some hard answers on how the math works here, I unpacked the game code and I tested everything I could find about the damage calculations in Project Zomboid. This is my biggest deep dive video ever, and we're going to look at all of the more than 20 factors that determine your damage in this game. So, if you want to stay alive, protect your home, and protect your friends, let's go. Alright, we'll break the video into two parts. We're going to look at the damage calculations in the order that the game processes them. And for the most part, we can break that into two sections. We have the internal half, and then the situational half. For the most part, the first calculations, the internal ones, have to do with the state of your character. That's your moodles, your weight, your weapon skill, that sort of thing. Then we have the situational calculations. These are things that you need to think about in every fight, like your combat positioning, your attack combo, your target's armor rating, stuff to make the most out of every fight. If you already know a lot of this stuff, just scroll through the different topics in this video, because I can almost guarantee that you will find some new information in here today. Alright, so let's get into it. Internal factors first. So let's look at the easiest thing first. This is your base weapon damage. If you've looked at Project Zomboid's wiki, you already know this part. Every weapon in Project Zomboid has a minimum and a maximum damage value. Easy enough, the game randomly chooses a starting value from within that range every time you make an attack. Now, step 2 is pretty cool. Let's call it your big Bruiser Bonus. If you attack with an axe, a spear, or a long blunt weapon, and you have at least 3 levels in that weapon skill, you will get a 10% extra damage boost right here. So that's a 1.1 times multiplier. Or if you have level 7 in the weapon skill, you get a 20% damage bonus. So if you ever felt that axes, spears, or long blunt weapons were very good in the late game, now you know why. Now, step 3 is for melee weapons only. We're going to add a strength multiplier. Your default strength in Project Zomboid is level 5, and that gets you a 1.0 multiplier, so no real effect on your score. But for every skill point above or below level 5, we're going to add or subtract 0.05 or 5% from that multiplier. So at 0 strength, you're down a 25% damage penalty. But at level 10 strength, that's 5 levels above 5, so you've gained 25% damage. If you want to get buff and get more damage, check out my nutrition video to get a strength XP bonus from protein. Step 4 is also for melee weapons only, and this one is a penalty, your pain penalty. Maybe you haven't noticed this, but attacking while in pain can sometimes reduce your damage. See, pain is pretty tricky. For every melee attack you make, the game will check all of your wounds, like bites, scratches, and whatever. All of these wounds contribute a pain score. The game's going to look at your total pain score, but only for your right upper arm, lower arm, and hand. If you're using a two-handed weapon, it's also going to use the pain from your left arm and left hand. Now, there's a lot more going on here after this, and I'll make a separate video, but basically your arm and hand pain can reduce your damage by up to 97%. And what's worse, the pain moodle is not helpful here, because it shows you your total body pain, and your damage is only affected by the pain on your arms and your hands. So you gotta keep track of these wounds by yourself. But here's some tips. Remember that you can reduce pain with painkillers or alcohol. Check out one of my alcohol videos for more about that. And bandaging your wounds will also reduce pain in some cases, but this only applies for bites and stitches. But if you bandage those, you can reduce pain by 50%. Of course, you can also ignore your entire pain penalty by using guns, because the pain penalty is for melee only. Alright, after the pain penalty, Project Zomboid will look for your weight penalty. Now, I don't know if you noticed this already, but the weight penalty is actually bad for your melee weapons as well as your firearms. You really can't escape it. So if you have the underweight trait at 70 kilograms or less, you lose 20% on all damage. At very underweight, which is below 60 kilos, you instead lose 40% damage. And if you are emaciated at 50 kilograms, you're losing 60% of all your damage. This weight penalty is absolutely brutal, but you can watch my Project Zomboid calories video if you want to keep up your weight and prevent this penalty. Now for step 6, the game code has what it calls the Super Attack Multiplier. This is a 5 times damage multiplier, but I gotta be honest with you, I have no idea what this is. I couldn't find how the code uses this, and I saw no way to actually trigger it. I think this is some unused code at the moment. It might be an old feature that got dropped, but drop some comments if you have any ideas about this. Step 7 then is the panic penalty. Panic is bad for lots of reasons, but as far as damage is concerned, it actually works differently for your melee weapons and firearms. If you have a melee weapon, your panic penalty doesn't start until level 2. Level 1 panic by itself doesn't do anything, but at level 2 you will lose 0.1 damage for every panicked level. So you lose 0.2 at level 2 or 0.4 at level 4. Then for firearms, the panic penalty doesn't start until level 3, but at level 3 panic, you reduce your damage by 0.2 per level. So you lose 0.6 damage at panic 3 or 0.8 damage at panic 4. That means panic is twice as bad for firearms compared to guns. But here's something cool. If you have 6 or more levels in aiming, you'll ignore this penalty completely with firearms. So if you have high aiming, guns are a safe bet even when you are highly panicked. And keep in mind that the panic penalty is not a multiplier. It is a flat reduction on damage. So if your weapon only deals like 0.8 damage and you're losing 0.4 due to panic, that's really bad. So it's better to use heavy hitting weapons with stuff like 2.0 damage if you're panicked, because then losing 0.4 from your panic isn't that bad. Remember too that beta blockers or alcohol will reduce your panic, so keep those on hand for big fights. Step number 8 then in the Step number 8 in the damage formula is the stress penalty. This comes from your anxiety modal. This counts for melee and ranged weapons, and it doesn't start until level 2. So level 1 stress has no effect on damage. Otherwise, you reduce your damage by 0.1 for every stress level. Again, this is not a multiplier, so small damage weapons might be losing maybe half of their total damage, whereas big damage weapons will feel less affected here. Step 9 now is super special. I call it the salvation step, and this tries to set your minimum damage at 0.1. So stress, panic, weight, pain, and the strength penalties should not be able to completely nerf your damage. But weirdly, if your damage is exactly 0, you don't get salvation. So you do need negative damage or slightly below 0.1 in order for salvation to kick in. Step 10, this is the Stomp Effect, and this is a very positive one. Thanks to the Stomp Effect, you can probably get out of a bad situation if you just stomp it out. Stomping completely resets the damage calculation, ignoring strength, weight, panic, pain, and stress penalties. Stomp uses a special damage calculation, and it works like this. You get a random base damage value from between 0.7 up to 1.0, then add 0.2 per level in strength. So a default strength, 5 strength, that gets you an additional 1.0 damage. Then if you're not wearing any shoes or boots, you will lose 50% of your stomp damage. Barefoot stomps are never a great idea, so go get some shoes. Then if you are wearing shoes or boots, you actually get a stomp damage bonus. This depends on what footwear you're wearing, but for military boots, this is a 2.5 times damage. Sneakers will get you a 1.8 times damage, so usually it's a pretty good bonus. Remember though, you can only stomp a zombie that's on the ground, so it is pretty situational, but you get a big bonus for attacking downed zombies as well, so stay tuned for that because it's coming up in a minute. First, step 11 and step 12, these are the last steps of what I call the internal calculations. This is about exhaustion and fatigue, or you might call it endurance and tiredness. You've probably figured this out by now, but both of these moodles are truly awful. At level 1, just one of these moodles will take away 50% of your damage. So even at level 1, they're extremely bad. Then by the time they hit level 4, you are losing 95% of your damage. And in case that's not bad enough, exhaustion and fatigue do stack together, right? All of this stacks. So if you have level 4 exhaustion and level 4 fatigue, you are dealing less than 1% total damage. So you need to take exhaustion and fatigue very seriously if you want to survive in Project Zomboid. My first tip is for you to use guns. Ranged weapons will ignore these moodles, so if you really need to, you can lock and load your way out of trouble. Obviously, make sure that your character gets lots of sleep, and if you want tips on recovering exhaustion, you can check out my exhaustion deep dive video. There is one super easy trick to recover exhaustion very quickly, and if you know that trick, please drop it in the comments for people to check out. Quick side note now while you digest the first half of this video. If you like indie games and you want to support some indie game development, check out my website, trombospace.com. I've got a new minigame up there now called Snack, and I don't want to say too much, but if you want to add a bit of demented spookiness to your holiday season, I really think you might get a funny kick out of it. I also just pushed a big update to my elemental immersion game Gaia Snake, which now starts with all challenges and environments unlocked. So you can go in and craft the Gaia Snake levels that you want right from the moment you start playing. You can also subscribe to my mailing list at trombospace.com, and who knows, maybe one day I'll announce a game that doesn't involve snakes. Okay, so now we're done with the internal calculations. We're going to move on to the situational calculations now, which are mostly about your attack positioning and your targets. So let's look at step 13 of the damage formula, and this is your body part multiplier. This only works when you attack down Zeds, and basically there are two special things that might happen if you hit the legs or the head. Let's start with the legs. If you have a zombie on the ground and the game thinks that you're hitting its legs, your damage calculation will get an override here that sets your damage to exactly 0.05. That is basically nothing. On the other hand, if you hit some heads, that is awesome. If you hit the head, you get a 3 times damage multiplier. It sounds good, but there is a trick here. The game is pretty finicky on how it checks your targeting, so if you want to avoid hitting zombie legs and get better at hitting zombie heads, I strongly recommend that you check out Retinaru's video about Project Zomboid targeting. This video is pretty much required viewing for this game, so make sure you check it out sometime. Next, have a look at what your target is wearing. In step 14, we look at the armor penalty, and zombies will get an armor bonus here based on their clothing. If you ever thought that firefighter zombies or zombies in leather can seem up to 5 times tougher than normal Zeds, this is why. If your target zombie is standing, the game is going to randomly choose a body part and check what that part is wearing. Your damage will then get reduced by the scratch resistance of that clothing, and it uses the resistance as a percent. So if they have body armor with 50 scratch resistance, you might deal only 50% damage to that Zed. If they have a helmet with 100 scratch resistance, that is very bad. But don't worry, the game will cap zombie armor at 79%. This armor stuff is actually pretty cool because bladed weapons and spears can create holes in clothing while you fight, and those holes will reduce scratch resistance. So if you're up against police, firefighters, lots of leather or other heavily armored Zeds, you can pull out a blade or a spear and have an easier time with it. Okay, step 15 now is insane. This is the critical hit check, and it uses a huge series of calculations to determine your critical hit chance. Truly, there is a lot of things affecting your critical hits here. So if you want to get more critical hits, check out my critical hit deep dive. It's a whole different video. The absolute basics of critical hits is just this. You have some chance to add a critical hit multiplier to your damage, and usually that multiplier is between 2 times and 10 times damage. There are some special modifiers on crit chance, and then also weapons like guns, knives, and spears have some extra special techniques for crits. So I really recommend you check out my critical hit video if you want to know more about it and get better at critical hits. Next up, we look at your combo factor. The attack combo bonus isn't easy to notice, but it's super useful for people who like to use short blade weapons. If you hit a zombie at least 4 times, then you have started a damage multiplier based on a combo formula. The formula goes like this. Your multiplier gets 1 point for every hit on the zombie, then subtract 2 points, then multiply that by 1.5. So basically your first combo hit, that's hit number 4, will get 3 times damage, and then hit number 5 gets 4.5 times damage, and this just keeps going up. This is cool because short blade weapons usually do very little damage. However, they also cost like 0 exhaustion to use. So making small attacks with these weapons will add up into some big damage and only 0 exhaustion, thanks to the combo factor. Now, step 17 is something you have total control over. This is your distance factor. The distance factor was sort of the big discovery that launched my channel, and I think it's a really cool combat mechanic. Basically, you want to make a high distance factor because it's going to multiply your damage. The calculations for your distance factor have changed a bit over time, but here's how it works today. For melee weapons, the game gets the distance from you to your target. Then it divides that distance by your weapon's maximum range. So if your attack distance is about the same as your maximum weapon range, that'll get you a value hopefully close to 1. If your distance is less than maximum range, the value will be less than 1. So try to hit melee targets at max range. For shotguns, it's different. The game just sets your distance factor to 1 automatically. Range does not matter for damage on these types of weapons, which are called range fall-off weapons. For all other gun types, the distance factor is set to 0.5 automatically. Then, now that the game has some basic distance factor for you, it will multiply that by 2 to create your damage multiplier. So melee weapons can get up to a 2 times damage bonus depending on your distance, whereas shotguns will always get a 2 times damage bonus. And then for other guns, this just creates a 1 times multiplier, so there's really no effect here. Interesting note for guns here though, the game code used to use the distance factor to boost your damage on point-blank attacks. Right now though, that code doesn't actually get used. But point-blank damage is still good. You can get a better critical hit chance for point-blank attacks. So although point-blank doesn't affect your distance factor and your damage directly, it does help your critical hits. Alright, moving to step 18, this is an easy one. This is the back attack bonus. If you are behind your target, you get a 1.5 times damage multiplier. It requires you to be a bit sneaky, but that's 50% extra damage, so it's pretty good. Step 19 now is a bit funky, but if you want to fight other players, or you want to attack the future NPCs, you should be aware of this one. This is the character type modifier. Just so you know, if you attack a zombie character, the game is actually going to multiply your damage by 1.5, so an automatic 50% bonus against zombies. But if you attack a survivor character, some player or an NPC, the game is actually going to reduce your damage by 60%. This was difficult for me to test because player HP is handled differently than zombie HP, but once we have proper NPCs in the game, I think this is going to be important. This basically means NPCs will be much harder to kill compared to zombies, especially if they're smart about what armor they're using. Okay, step 20, this is your weapon perk multiplier. But Trombo, you say, didn't we already talk about this? And yes, you're right. Back at step 2, we said that axes, spears, and long blunt weapons get a damage boost at level 3 and again at level 7. But actually, that was just extra. Those 3 weapon types, they get the Bruiser Bonus, and that's actually just a greedy double dip on extra damage. So here's how your regular combat levels also affect your damage for all weapon types. At level 0, all of your weapon skills actually have an automatic 0.3 multiplier on damage. This means you are losing 70% of your damage just because your character doesn't know what they're doing. But then every time you level up the skill, you gain 0.1 on this multiplier. This is really cool. That means at level 1 skill, you go from a 0.3 multiplier up to a 0.4. Sure, your damage still isn't great, but by gaining that 1 level, your multiplier just got 33% bigger. Then, here's where it gets interesting. We saw that going from level 0 to level 1 increases your perk multiplier by 33%. But now, check out the max levels. When you go from level 9 to level 10, your multiplier goes from 1.2 up to 1.3. So your multiplier only increased by about 8%. This means that the early combat levels give you the biggest boost to your damage. So keep that in mind. Grabbing a few little combat levels on character creation or grinding out those weapon levels in the early game can actually make for very substantial increases on your damage. And step 21 now, let's look at your ground attack bonus. This is probably my favorite bonus in the game, and I highly recommend that you exploit it to its full potential. If you attack a zombie that's down on the ground, the game uses a bit of a formula here. It's going to multiply your damage by 5 or by your weapon's critical hit multiplier, whichever is higher. So this is sort of like an extra automatic critical multiplier that does a minimum of 5 times damage, which is amazing. And yes, this does stack with normal critical hits. But let's make it even better. Remember how we talked about the body part multiplier back in step 13? We said if you score a headshot on a downed zombie, that would be 3 times damage on that attack. But now that 3 times multiplier is getting multiplied again by this ground attack multiplier. So a head attack on a downed Zed actually gets you a 15 times damage multiplier at the end of the day. You cannot pass this up. So if you want to get Zeds on the ground and score these big bonuses, check out this fence fighting video from PZB, because fences are going to help you get those Zeds on the ground. Okay, our next step is easy. This is your two-handed weapon penalty. For step 22 here, the game checks to see if you have a two-handed weapon. If you are using a two-handed weapon, but you equipped it in only one hand, you're going to lose 50% of your damage. So make sure you use two-handed weapons properly, because a one-handed weapon will almost always do more damage than a two-handed weapon that's only in one hand. So now you see how damage works, and while it's all fresh in your mind, tell me what you think. Did anything stand out to you as surprising or unusual? Did you have a hard time believing anything here, and maybe do you want to see some follow-up testing on any of this? Does any of this go against your intuition or your experience with the game? Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more Project Zomboid science, and if you want to get involved or support in other ways, you can join me in my Discord server or check out my games at trombospace.com. Good luck in the End Time Survivor, and thanks for watching.